name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone used to call me Maggie. I'm 28 years old, and I'm standing outside St. Mary's Cathedral right now, holding a manila folder that's about to change everything. Inside this folder is 10 years of evidence that will finally expose the truth about why my own father looked me in the eye and said, "You're dead to us." I can see wedding guests streaming into the church from my younger sister's ceremony. The wedding I wasn't invited to. The wedding that's being paid for with stolen money. Before I tell you how I got here, and what's in this file that's going to destroy my family's perfect facade, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe, because what I'm about to reveal will shock you to your core. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when I walk into that church. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone, and my family was considered one of the pillars of the community. My father, Harold Thompson, was the respected bank manager and served on the town council. My mother, Dorothy, taught third grade at the local elementary school. We had this picture-perfect life that everyone admired from the outside. Our house was a beautiful colonial on Maple Street, with a white picket fence and rose bushes that my mother tended religiously. Every Sunday, we'd sit in the front pew at St. Mary's Cathedral, dressed in our finest clothes. Harold would shake hands with half the congregation after service, and Dorothy would organize bake sales and volunteer for every school fundraiser. My younger sister Janet was 3 years behind me, and from early on, it was clear she was the favored child. She had this sweet, compliant personality that my parents adored. Janet never questioned anything, never challenged authority, and always did exactly what was expected of her. She was pretty in that conventional way that made adults coo over her, with blonde curls and blue eyes that seemed to sparkle when she smiled. I was different. I excelled academically, especially in mathematics and science. While Janet struggled with basic algebra, I was winning state science fairs and earning recognition for my research projects. At 16, I took first place in the Ohio State Science Fair, with a project on forensic accounting techniques. Yes, even then I was fascinated by numbers and uncovering the truth hidden in financial records. The scholarship opportunities started pouring in during my junior year of high school. Northwestern University offered me a full ride for their accounting program. Other prestigious schools followed suit. You'd think my parents would be proud, but I started noticing subtle signs of resentment. Harold would make comments like, "Well, aren't you the little genius?" with a tone that didn't sound congratulatory. When neighbors praised my achievements, he'd quickly redirect the conversation to Janet's accomplishments, no matter how minor. "Janet just made the junior varsity cheerleading squad," he'd say, as if that somehow balanced out my academic success. Dorothy was more passive-aggressive. She'd forget to mention my awards at family dinners, but would spend 20 minutes discussing Janet's latest crush or shopping trip. When I brought home straight A's, she'd say, "That's nice, dear," and immediately ask Janet about her day. The only person who truly celebrated my success was my maternal grandmother, Rose. She was this fierce, independent woman who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years and understood the value of education. Grandma Rose would slip me $20 bills and whisper, "Don't let anyone dim your light, Maggie. You're going to do great things." But even Grandma Rose couldn't see what was happening beneath the surface of our perfect family. I started noticing things that didn't add up. Harold claimed we were struggling financially, yet he always had money for Janet's expensive clothes and activities. He'd complain about the cost of my school supplies while buying Janet a new outfit for every social event. There were hushed phone conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Bills that came in red envelopes that Harold would quickly hide. Credit card statements that disappeared before I could glimpse them. My analytical mind was already picking up on inconsistencies, but I didn't have enough information to understand what they meant. The family dinners that looked so perfect from the outside were actually tense affairs. Harold dominated every conversation, and any attempt to discuss ideas or current events was quickly shut down if it didn't align with his opinions. Dorothy rarely spoke unless Harold asked her a direct question. Janet learned early to agree with everything Harold said. I, on the other hand, had opinions. I questioned things. When Harold made statements about politics or social issues that seemed unfair or illogical, I'd ask for clarification. This never went well. He'd get this look in his eyes, like I had personally insulted him, and the temperature in the room would drop 10 degrees. "Maggie thinks she knows everything," became his favorite phrase. He'd say it with a laugh, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach clench. Dorothy would nod along, and Janet would giggle, and I'd feel like I was the only one who could see how wrong everything was. Despite the growing tension at home, I threw myself into my studies and extracurricular activities. I was president of the math club, captain of the academic decathlon team, and valedictorian of my graduating class. I had plans, goals, and dreams that extended far beyond our small town. But as graduation approached and my acceptance to Northwestern became reality, the atmosphere at home grew increasingly hostile. Harold started making comments about how college would change me and how I'd probably forget where I came from. He questioned whether higher education was really necessary for girls, suggesting that I might be better off staying local and finding a nice husband. These weren't casual observations. They were calculated attempts to undermine my confidence and keep me under his control. Even at 17, I could recognize manipulation when I saw it, though I didn't fully understand why my own father would want to sabotage my future. The summer before I was supposed to leave for Northwestern changed everything. I had decided to work part-time at Harold's bank to save money for college expenses that my scholarship didn't cover. Harold presented this as a generous opportunity for me to learn about the real world and gain valuable work experience. First National Bank of Millbrook was a small community bank where Harold had worked his way up from teller to manager over 15 years. Everyone in town trusted him with their money, their mortgages, their children's college funds. He had a reputation for being conservative, careful, and absolutely honest. My job was supposed to be simple filing, data entry, and general office assistance. But my naturally analytical mind couldn't help but notice patterns in the paperwork I was handling. Numbers that didn't quite line up. Transactions that seemed odd or out of place. Discrepancies that made my stomach turn. At first, I thought I was misunderstanding the banking procedures. I'd been working there for about 3 weeks when I came across a series of transfers that made no sense. Money was being moved from customer accounts into a holding account, then transferred again to an account I didn't recognize. The amounts were small, usually under $500, but they were happening regularly. I spent my lunch breaks in the break room, quietly reviewing the files I had access to. The pattern became clearer and more disturbing. Harold was systematically skimming money from customer accounts, particularly elderly customers who might not notice small discrepancies in their statements. Mrs. Patterson, who was 92 years old and rarely left her house, had been missing $25 here, $50 there, for over 2 years. Mr. Chen, who had dementia and whose son managed his finances from 3 states away, was missing even larger amounts. The most heartbreaking was the children's savings accounts. Harold was stealing from kids' college funds, $5 and $10 at a time. I felt sick. This was my father, the man who lectured me about honesty and integrity, the man who made me return a candy bar to the store when I was 8 because I forgot to pay for it. He was stealing from people who trusted him, people who considered him a friend. I tried to convince myself there was an explanation. Maybe these were legitimate fees I didn't understand. Maybe there was some banking procedure that justified these transfers. I spent hours after work researching banking regulations and account management protocols, desperate to find an innocent explanation. But the more I learned, the clearer it became that what Harold was doing was theft, plain and simple embezzlement from people who had no idea they were being victimized. I decided to approach him privately, giving him the benefit of the doubt and a chance to explain. I waited until we were alone in his office after hours, when the rest of the staff had gone home. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the files I had been studying. "Dad," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I've been noticing some irregularities in the account transfers. Could you help me understand what these transactions are for?" The change in Harold's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The warm, paternal mask he usually wore completely disappeared. His face went pale, then flushed red with anger. His eyes became cold and calculating in a way I had never seen before. "You've been going through files that aren't part of your job," he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "You've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." "I was just trying to understand," I stammered. "I thought maybe I was missing something." "You're missing respect for your father and your place in this family," he snapped. "These are complex banking procedures that you couldn't possibly understand. You're 17 years old, Maggie. You don't know anything about the real world." But I could see the panic in his eyes, even as he tried to intimidate me into backing down. He knew I had stumbled onto something big, and he was scrambling to regain control of the situation. Over the next few days, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic. He started monitoring my work closely, limiting my access to files, and making comments about my overactive imagination and tendency to create problems where none existed. He began a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility, even within our own family. At dinner, he'd make jokes about my conspiracy theories and how I was seeing patterns that weren't there. Dorothy and Janet laughed along, not understanding that he was laying the groundwork to discredit anything I might say about what I had discovered. I felt trapped and alone. I couldn't discuss this with my mother because she would immediately side with Harold without even listening to the evidence. Janet was too young and too devoted to Harold to be trusted with something this serious. Grandma Rose was the only person who might believe me, but she lived 2 hours away, and I rarely saw her without family supervision. Meanwhile, I continued to uncover more evidence of Harold's crimes. I discovered that he wasn't just stealing from customer accounts. He was also embezzling from the church building fund, the local Little League organization, and several charity accounts that the bank managed. The total amount was staggering, easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars over several years. The worst part was realizing that our family's comfortable lifestyle was built on stolen money. The nice vacations, Janet's expensive clothes, even the renovations to our house. It was all paid for with money that belonged to other people. People who had worked hard for their savings. People who had sacrificed to put money aside for their children's futures. I was facing an impossible choice. I could expose Harold's crimes and destroy our family's reputation and financial security. Or I could stay silent and become complicit in ongoing theft from innocent people. Either way, my relationship with my family would be irreparably damaged. The situation reached a breaking point when I discovered that Harold had been stealing from the Children's Hospital Charity Fund. Our church had been collecting donations for 6 months to buy new equipment for the pediatric ward. Families in our community had sacrificed to contribute to this cause, holding bake sales and car washes to raise money for sick children. Harold had been systematically siphoning off portions of these donations for over 4 months. Every time someone wrote a check to help dying children, he was stealing a percentage for himself. This wasn't just financial crime anymore. This was morally reprehensible theft from the most vulnerable members of our community. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything else. The weight of what I knew was crushing me. I had documented evidence of systematic embezzlement that had been going on for years, but I was just a 17-year-old girl who was financially dependent on the very man I needed to expose. I decided to confront Harold one more time, hoping that presenting him with the full scope of his crimes might shock him into confession and restitution. I had compiled a comprehensive file of evidence, organized chronologically and by victim. I had documentation showing the pattern of theft, the methods he used to cover his tracks, and the devastating impact on his victims. When I approached him in his home office that evening, he was sitting at his desk, presumably working on bank business. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Here was a man who projected honesty and integrity to the entire community, while systematically robbing the people who trusted him most. "Dad, we need to talk," I said, closing the office door behind me. "I have documentation of systematic embezzlement from bank customer accounts, church funds, and charity organizations. I know what you've been doing, and I know how long it's been going on." Harold's reaction was swift and vicious. He stood up so quickly that his chair fell backward. His face contorted with rage, but beneath the anger I could see genuine fear. He knew his carefully constructed house of cards was about to collapse. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, using language I had never heard from him before. "After everything I've done for you, everything I've provided for this family, you want to destroy us all based on your ridiculous theories?" "These aren't theories," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I have documentation. Bank records, transfer receipts, account statements. You've stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who trusted you." Harold's expression shifted from rage to cold calculation. I could almost see him weighing his options, trying to figure out how to regain control of the situation. When he spoke again, his voice was eerily calm. "Here's what's going to happen," he said slowly. "You're going to give me every piece of paper you think you have, and you're never going to speak about this again. To anyone. Ever. Or you can pack your bags and get out of this house tonight. Your choice." "Dad, these people deserve to know what you've done to them," I pleaded. "Mrs. Patterson's Social Security checks, the children's college funds, the money for sick kids at the hospital. How can you live with yourself?" "I live with myself just fine," he replied. "I've provided for this family, put food on the table, and given you opportunities you never would have had otherwise. You want to bite the hand that feeds you? Fine. But you won't do it while living under my roof." The ultimatum was clear. I could destroy the evidence and pretend I had never discovered his crimes, essentially becoming an accessory to ongoing theft. Or I could maintain my integrity and lose my family forever. I thought about all the victims whose money he had stolen. Elderly people living on fixed incomes who didn't deserve to have their savings pilfered by someone they trusted. Children whose college funds had been depleted by a man who smiled at them in church every Sunday. Sick kids who needed medical equipment that might not be purchased because the money intended for their care was sitting in Harold's personal account. I can't pretend I don't know, I said quietly. I can't be part of this. Harold's face hardened into an expression I had never seen before. In that moment, I realized that the father I thought I knew had never really existed. The man standing in front of me was a stranger, a criminal who was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to protect his illegal activities. Then you're no daughter of mine, he said coldly. Pack your things. You have until tomorrow morning to get out of this house, and don't ever contact this family again. You're dead to us. The words hit me like physical blows. Despite everything I had discovered about Harold's criminal activities, I had never imagined he would choose his illegal schemes over his own child. I had thought that confronting him with evidence might lead to confession, restitution, and family healing. Instead, it had led to complete rejection and exile. Within hours, Harold had called Dorothy and Janet into his office for a family meeting that I wasn't invited to attend. From my bedroom, I could hear the murmur of voices and occasional gasps from my mother and sister. Harold was spinning the narrative, painting me as mentally unstable, jealous of Janet, and determined to destroy the family out of spite. When Dorothy emerged from the office, her eyes were red from crying, but when she looked at me, there was no sympathy. Only disappointment and accusation. How could you make up such horrible lies about your father? She asked. He's provided everything for you, and this is how you repay him? By trying to destroy his reputation with these fantasies? Janet was even worse. She looked at me with genuine disgust, as if I were some kind of monster who had tried to hurt the family for entertainment. You're sick, Maggie, she said. Dad explained how jealous you've always been, how you resent our family's success. I can't believe you'd make up stories about stealing just to get attention. The speed with which my mother and sister accepted Harold's version of events was devastating. They didn't ask to see the evidence. They didn't question why I would make up such specific, detailed accusations. They simply believed Harold because it was easier than confronting the possibility that the man they loved and depended on was a criminal. That night, as I packed my few belongings into 2 suitcases, I realized that my family had made their choice. They preferred Harold's lies to my truth, and there was nothing I could do to change their minds. The next morning, I left the house where I had grown up, carrying everything I owned in 2 suitcases and a backpack. Harold was already at work, avoiding the awkwardness of actually watching me leave. Dorothy stood in the kitchen, crying but refusing to look at me. Janet had locked herself in her room. Grandma Rose was the only family member who seemed to understand that something was seriously wrong. When I called her from a payphone at the bus station, she immediately offered to pick me up and let me stay with her until I figured out my next steps. I don't know what happened between you and your father, she said, but I know you're not the kind of person who would lie about something serious. Whatever's going on, we'll figure it out together. Those words meant everything to me in that moment. At least one person in my family was willing to consider that I might be telling the truth. I stayed with Grandma Rose for 2 weeks before leaving for Northwestern University. During those weeks, she listened as I explained what I had discovered about Harold's embezzlement. Unlike my parents and sister, she asked to see the evidence. She examined the bank records and transfer receipts with the skilled eye of someone who had worked in accounting for decades. This is serious, Maggie, she said after reviewing everything I had documented. Your father has been stealing from these people for years. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I wrestled with that question constantly. I had the evidence to expose Harold and potentially recover some of the stolen money for his victims. But I also knew that doing so would destroy any chance of reconciliation with my family and would likely send Harold to prison. In the end, I made a decision that I would question for the next 10 years. I decided to start college with a clean slate, to focus on building my own life and career, and to hope that somehow Harold would find his conscience and stop stealing from innocent people. I gave Grandma Rose copies of all the evidence and made her promise to keep them safe. If anything happens to me, I told her, or if you hear that Harold's victims need help, please make sure this information gets to the right authorities. Starting college at Northwestern was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time in my life, I was completely on my own. No family support, no safety net, no one to fall back on if things went wrong. But I was also free from Harold's manipulation and the toxic family dynamics that had been suffocating me for years. I worked multiple jobs to support myself, tutoring other students, working in the library, serving tables at a local restaurant. My academic scholarship covered tuition and fees, but I needed to pay for housing, food, books, and all the other expenses of college life. The work was exhausting, but it was also empowering. Every dollar I earned was honest money that I had worked for myself. I didn't have to wonder if my textbooks were paid for with money stolen from elderly bank customers, or if my meal plan was funded by theft from children's charity accounts. My academic performance remained excellent despite the financial stress. If anything, my experiences with Harold's embezzlement had reinforced my interest in forensic accounting and financial crime investigation. I threw myself into my coursework, particularly classes related to fraud detection and white-collar crime. My professors noticed my passion for the subject and my natural aptitude for identifying financial irregularities. Dr. Elizabeth Morris, who taught advanced forensic accounting, became a mentor and eventually helped me secure an internship with the FBI's white-collar crime division during my junior year. Working with federal investigators was eye-opening. I learned about the sophisticated methods criminals use to hide their activities and the devastating impact financial crimes have on victims and communities. I also learned that many embezzlement cases go undetected for years because victims trust the perpetrators and don't carefully monitor their accounts. Every case I worked on reminded me of Harold's victims back in Ohio, Mrs. Patterson, who probably still didn't know that her savings had been depleted. Mr. Chen's family, who might never realize that their father's care money had been stolen. The children whose college funds had been pilfered by someone they saw in church every Sunday. The guilt of my silence ate at me constantly. I had the evidence to stop Harold's crimes and help his victims recover at least some of their losses. But I also knew that exposing him would mean admitting that I had been right all along, something my family seemed incapable of accepting. Through Grandma Rose, I received occasional updates about the family I had left behind. Harold had apparently convinced everyone that I had suffered some kind of mental breakdown and disappeared rather than face my delusions about him. The story he told was that I had become jealous of Janet's success and had tried to destroy the family with false accusations. Dorothy and Janet had fully embraced this narrative. They told people that I had been unstable and manipulative, that I had always resented Janet's popularity and Harold's success. Some people in town felt sorry for Harold, thinking he was dealing with the tragedy of having a mentally ill daughter who had abandoned the family. The most painful part was learning that my academic achievements had been erased from family history. My scholarships, my science fair victories, my valedictorian status, none of it was ever mentioned. It was as if I had never existed, or had never accomplished anything worth remembering. Janet thrived in my absence. Without me around to overshadow her academically, she became the star of the family. She was homecoming queen, prom queen, and graduated with decent grades that seemed impressive compared to Harold's stories about my instability. She started dating the son of the wealthiest family in town, a boy named Robert, whose father owned the largest manufacturing company in the county. Harold's career also seemed to be flourishing. He received promotions at the bank and took on additional responsibilities in the community. He joined the country club and the Chamber of Commerce. People respected him even more, seeing him as a tragic figure who had overcome the challenge of having a difficult daughter. But Grandma Rose noticed things that others missed. The family seemed to have financial stress, despite Harold's apparent success. Dorothy looked tired and anxious all the time. Harold was drinking more and had developed a short temper that sometimes showed through his public facade. "Something's not right," Grandma Rose told me during one of our phone calls. "Your father's story doesn't add up, and people are starting to notice inconsistencies. I think his problems are getting worse, not better." As I progressed through college and into my early career with the FBI, I tried to build a life completely separate from the family that had rejected me. I made close friends who became like chosen family, people who valued honesty and integrity, and who supported each other through difficult times. My work with the white-collar crime division was both challenging and rewarding. I specialized in embezzlement and financial fraud cases, helping to investigate and prosecute criminals who stole from employers, customers, and community organizations. Every case I solved felt like a small victory for justice, even though I couldn't bring myself to pursue justice in my own family situation. My colleagues knew that I had grown up in a small town in Ohio, and that I wasn't close to my biological family, but I never told anyone the real reason for the estrangement. It was too complicated, too painful, and too personal to share with people who might not understand the impossible position I had been in. Dr. Morris, my former professor, who had become a close friend and mentor, was the only person who knew the full story. She had encouraged me to pursue the case against Harold, but she also understood my reluctance to destroy the only family I had ever known. Sometimes doing the right thing requires sacrificing relationships with people who refuse to see the truth, she told me. But that doesn't make it any easier to live with. I threw myself into therapy to process the trauma of family rejection and the guilt of remaining silent about Harold's crimes. My therapist helped me understand that I had been gaslighted and manipulated by someone who was supposed to protect me, and that my family's inability to believe me said more about them than it did about me. The therapy was helpful, but it couldn't completely alleviate the guilt I felt about Harold's continuing victims. Every time I worked on a case involving embezzlement from elderly victims or theft from charity organizations, I thought about the people back in Ohio who were still being victimized by my father. I dated occasionally, but I struggled with trust issues and had difficulty forming deep romantic relationships. How could I trust someone else when my own family had chosen a criminal's lies over my documented truth? How could I build a healthy relationship when I was carrying such a massive secret about my past? My career flourished despite my personal struggles. I developed a reputation as a thorough, ethical investigator who could uncover financial crimes that other agents missed. I received commendations for my work and was promoted ahead of schedule. My success was satisfying, but it was also bittersweet. The people who should have been proudest of my accomplishments had no idea what I was doing with my life. Through Grandma Rose, I learned that Janet had gotten engaged to Robert during her senior year of college. The engagement was big news in our small town, since Robert's family was so prominent in the community. Harold was apparently thrilled with the match and was already talking about the elaborate wedding they were planning. "It's going to be the social event of the year," Grandma Rose told me with a note of irony in her voice. "Your father's acting like he's marrying royalty. But something about the whole situation feels off to me." I pressed her for details, but she couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering her. She just had a feeling that Harold was putting on a show that was even more elaborate than usual, as if he was trying to prove something to the entire community. A few months later, Grandma Rose called with disturbing news. She had been talking to her friend Martha, who worked as a teller at Harold's bank, and Martha had mentioned some irregularities in customer accounts that were making everyone nervous. "Martha can't say much because of confidentiality rules," Grandma Rose explained. "But she's worried about some of the elderly customers. Their statements don't seem to match their deposits and withdrawals. She's thinking about talking to the regional manager." My heart sank. Harold's crimes were apparently continuing and possibly escalating. The evidence I had documented years earlier was now outdated, but the pattern of behavior was clearly ongoing. I realized that my decision to remain silent had allowed him to victimize even more people over the past several years. I started conducting my own quiet investigation, using the resources available to me as an FBI agent. I couldn't open an official investigation without probable cause and jurisdictional authority, but I could research Harold's current activities and financial situation. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. Harold's embezzlement had become much more sophisticated and extensive over the years. He was still stealing from customer accounts, but he had also expanded into mortgage fraud, insurance scams, and systematic theft from multiple charity organizations. The amounts involved were staggering. Based on my analysis, Harold had stolen well over $500,000 from various sources over the past 10 years. He was living far beyond what his legitimate salary could support, and he was using increasingly desperate measures to cover his tracks. Most troubling was the evidence that Harold's gambling addiction had intensified significantly. He was making regular trips to casinos in neighboring states and had racked up substantial debts with some very dangerous people. His theft was no longer just funding a comfortable lifestyle. It was supporting a serious gambling problem that was spiraling out of control. I realized that Harold's situation was reaching a crisis point. Gambling addicts in debt to criminal organizations often resort to increasingly desperate measures to raise money. His victims were no longer just losing their savings. They were potentially in danger if Harold's criminal associates decided to collect their debts through violence or intimidation. The moral weight of my continued silence was becoming unbearable. I had documentary evidence of ongoing crimes against innocent people, and I had the professional expertise and authority to stop those crimes. My personal feelings about family loyalty were no longer relevant when weighed against the harm Harold was causing to others. The final catalyst came when Grandma Rose called to tell me about Janet's wedding plans. The ceremony was scheduled for June 15th at St. Mary's Cathedral, with a reception at the country club that would accommodate over 300 guests. The estimated cost was astronomical for a small-town wedding, somewhere in the neighborhood of $75,000. Your father's telling everyone that he's been saving for this wedding since Janet was born, Grandma Rose said with obvious skepticism. But I've known Harold for 30 years, and he's never been the type to save money for anything. Where do you think he's getting the funds for this extravaganza? I didn't need to think about it. Harold was using stolen money to pay for Janet's wedding, just as he had used stolen money to fund our family's lifestyle throughout my childhood. The difference was that now I understood exactly where that money was coming from, and who was being hurt by his crimes. The guest list read like a who's who of Harold's victims. Mrs. Patterson would be there, along with dozens of other elderly bank customers whose accounts Harold had been draining for years. Church members who had contributed to charity drives would be celebrating while their donations paid for flowers and catering. The irony was nauseating. I spent weeks wrestling with my options. I could continue to remain silent and allow Harold to use his wedding day as a celebration of successful theft from the community. I could try to warn Janet privately, though I knew she would never believe me. Or I could finally do what I should have done 10 years earlier, expose Harold's crimes, and let justice take its course. The decision became easier when I learned that Harold had recently escalated his theft to fund wedding expenses. He had stolen money from a fund dedicated to purchasing playground equipment for the elementary school where Dorothy taught. Children would have fewer opportunities for safe recreation because Harold needed to pay for an elaborate wedding that would enhance his reputation in the community. I realized that my continued silence was no longer protecting my family. It was enabling the ongoing victimization of innocent people. Harold's crimes had grown bolder and more extensive because he believed he was untouchable. My family's refusal to consider the possibility of his guilt had given him 10 years of uninterrupted opportunity to steal from people who trusted him. I decided to coordinate with local law enforcement to ensure that Harold's arrest would be handled properly and that his victims would have the best chance of recovering their stolen money. I contacted the FBI field office that had jurisdiction over Harold's crimes and provided them with both my original evidence and the new documentation I had gathered. The agents were shocked by the scope and duration of Harold's criminal activities. They immediately opened a formal investigation and began working with state and local authorities to build a comprehensive case. They also coordinated with bank regulators to ensure that Harold's current victims would be protected. The timing of the investigation was carefully planned to minimize harm to innocent parties while maximizing the chance of successful prosecution. The wedding provided an ideal opportunity to arrest Harold in a public setting where he couldn't destroy evidence or flee to avoid prosecution. I volunteered to be present at the arrest to provide immediate consultation on the evidence and to help investigators understand the full scope of Harold's crimes. It would be the first time I had returned to my hometown in 10 years, and the first time I had seen my family since the day Harold exiled me for refusing to ignore his criminal activities. The personal cost of this decision was enormous. I knew that exposing Harold would mean destroying any remaining possibility of reconciliation with my mother and sister. Janet's wedding day would be ruined, and the family's reputation in the community would be permanently damaged. But I also knew that continued silence would make me complicit in ongoing crimes against innocent people. As I prepared to return to the town where I had grown up, I thought about all the victims whose money Harold had stolen over the years. They deserved justice, and they deserved to know the truth about the man they had trusted with their savings. My family's feelings were important, but they weren't more important than justice for the people Harold had victimized. The morning of Janet's wedding, I stood outside St. Mary's Cathedral in a professional business suit, carrying a manila folder that contained 10 years of documented evidence against Harold Thompson. The same church where our family had attended services every Sunday, where Harold had shaken hands with his victims and accepted their trust and admiration. Wedding guests were arriving in their finest clothes, many of them elderly members of the congregation, who had no idea that their savings had been stolen to pay for the elaborate ceremony they were about to witness. I recognized faces from my childhood. Mrs. Patterson, looking frail but dignified in her navy blue dress. Mr. Chen's son, who had flown in from California for the wedding. Families whose children's college funds had been pilfered by the man they considered a pillar of the community. The church looked beautiful, decorated with white roses and gold ribbons that had been paid for, with money stolen from charity organizations. The guest book was bound in white leather, that probably cost more than most of the congregation members spent on groceries in a month. Everything about the scene was elegant and tasteful, a perfect facade concealing the criminal activity that had made it possible. Harold was greeting guests at the entrance, looking every inch the proud father of the bride. He was wearing an expensive tuxedo and had clearly spared no expense on his appearance for this day. He smiled and shook hands with people whose money he had stolen, accepting their congratulations and well wishes with apparent genuine pleasure. When he spotted me approaching the church, the color drained from his face. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask slipped, and I could see the panic and calculation in his eyes. He quickly recovered his composure, but I could tell that my presence had rattled him severely. "Maggie," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "What a surprise to see you here. I didn't think you'd be able to make it." It was a masterful attempt to control the narrative, suggesting that I had been invited and that my presence was welcome rather than unexpected. But I could see the desperation behind his public performance. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied calmly. "I have something very important to share with everyone today." Harold's eyes darted to the folder in my hands, and I saw him swallow hard. He knew exactly what that folder contained, and he knew that his 10 years of crime were about to come to an end. The ceremony itself was beautiful, if you could ignore the source of the funding. Janet looked radiant in her designer wedding dress, and Robert seemed genuinely happy to be marrying her. Dorothy played the role of mother of the bride perfectly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief and beaming with pride. I sat in the back of the church, watching my sister promise to love and honor her new husband while my father looked on with obvious satisfaction. It struck me that this entire scene was built on lies and theft, that every beautiful detail had been purchased with money stolen from people who were sitting in those very pews. When the minister reached the traditional part of the ceremony where he asked if anyone had objections to the marriage, I stood up slowly. The rustle of my movement echoed through the suddenly silent cathedral as hundreds of heads turned to look at me. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the church, "but I have information that this congregation needs to hear before this celebration continues." Harold shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger and panic. "Maggie, this is neither the time nor the place for your personal issues. Please sit down and let your sister have her special day." But I was done being silenced and controlled. I was done protecting a criminal at the expense of his victims. I was done allowing my family to live in denial, while innocent people suffered. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I'm a federal agent with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division," I announced to the shocked congregation. "I'm here today because I have evidence that Harold Thompson has been systematically embezzling money from bank customer accounts, church funds, and charity organizations for over 10 years. The silence in the church was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop as 300 people processed what I had just said. Harold's face had gone from red to white, and he was gripping the back of a pew so tightly that his knuckles were bloodless. "That's a lie," he shouted, but his voice cracked with strain. "She's been making up stories about me for years. She's mentally unstable." I opened my folder and began reading from the documented evidence I had compiled. Account numbers, transfer amounts, dates and times of unauthorized transactions. The theft from Mrs. Patterson's Social Security account. The money stolen from the Children's Hospital Charity Fund. The embezzlement from the church building fund that had been used to pay for the very flowers decorating the altar. "This wedding," I continued, "is being paid for with money stolen from members of this congregation. Money that was taken from elderly customers' savings accounts, from children's college funds, and from charity donations intended to help the most vulnerable members of our community." The congregation erupted in shocked murmurs and angry voices. People were turning to look at each other, suddenly understanding that they had been victimized by someone they trusted completely. Mrs. Patterson was staring at Harold with horror and disbelief. Other elderly members of the congregation were frantically whispering to their adult children about irregularities they had noticed in their bank statements. Janet was standing at the altar in her wedding dress, tears streaming down her face as she realized that her perfect day was collapsing around her. Robert's family looked mortified, undoubtedly calculating the damage this scandal would do to their own reputation in the community. Dorothy was shaking her head in denial, still refusing to accept the evidence, even as it was being presented to hundreds of witnesses. "She's lying," she kept repeating. "She's always been jealous of our family. She's making this up." But the documentation was too comprehensive and detailed to dismiss as fabrication. I had bank records, transfer receipts, account statements, and a paper trail that clearly showed the pattern of theft over multiple years. This wasn't the word of an unstable daughter against a respected father. This was documented evidence of systematic criminal activity. Federal agents entered the church just as I finished presenting the most damning evidence. They had been waiting outside for my signal, ready to make the arrest once Harold's crimes had been publicly exposed. The timing was important because it prevented Harold from claiming that I was making false accusations or that the evidence had been fabricated. Harold Thompson, the lead agent, announced, "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft. You have the right to remain silent." As the handcuffs were placed on Harold's wrists, the full weight of 10 years of lies and denial came crashing down on our family. Janet collapsed into Robert's arms, sobbing uncontrollably as she realized that her wedding day had become the day her father was arrested for stealing from their friends and neighbors. Dorothy finally stopped denying the evidence and began to understand the magnitude of what Harold had done. Not just the financial crimes, but the systematic gaslighting and manipulation that had convinced her to reject her own daughter rather than question her husband's integrity. The wedding reception was canceled, of course. Guests filed out of the church in shocked silence, many of them calling their banks to check on their accounts or contacting family members to warn them about potential theft. The beautiful celebration that Harold had planned as the culmination of his successful deception had instead become the moment when all his crimes were finally exposed. The legal consequences for Harold were swift and severe. The federal investigation revealed that his embezzlement totaled over $600,000 from dozens of victims across multiple years. The evidence I had provided, combined with additional documentation uncovered during the investigation, made his conviction virtually certain. Harold pled guilty to multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and theft in exchange for a reduced sentence of 12 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to all his victims, though most of the stolen money had been gambled away or spent on maintaining the family's fraudulent lifestyle. The bank immediately fired Harold and cooperated fully with the investigation to identify all affected customers and implement stronger oversight procedures. Several other employees were disciplined for failing to notice the obvious irregularities in customer accounts, and the bank's insurance covered most of the customer losses that couldn't be recovered from Harold's assets. The church congregation was devastated by the revelation that someone they had trusted completely had been stealing from charity funds and building accounts. Pastor Williams led the community through a difficult process of healing and forgiveness, while also implementing new financial controls to prevent future theft. The impact on our family was catastrophic, but also revelatory. Janet's marriage to Robert proceeded after a 6-month delay, but the relationship with his family never fully recovered from the scandal. The elaborate wedding they had planned was replaced by a small, private ceremony that reflected their new understanding of the difference between genuine celebration and fraudulent display. Dorothy's world was completely shattered by Harold's arrest and the realization that she had spent 10 years believing his lies instead of her daughter's documented truth. She had to confront the fact that she had enabled Harold's crimes by refusing to question his explanations and by rejecting me when I tried to expose his criminal activity. The conversation Dorothy and I had 6 months after Harold's arrest was one of the most difficult of my life. She had requested the meeting through Grandma Rose, saying that she needed to apologize and try to understand what had really happened 10 years earlier. "I failed you as a mother," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I should have listened to you. I should have looked at the evidence. I should have protected you instead of protecting him." It was the apology I had wanted to hear for 10 years, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. I had lost my family during the most important years of my young adult life. I had been forced to build my career and personal relationships without any family support, all while carrying the guilt of knowing that my silence was enabling ongoing crimes against innocent people. Janet's apology was more complicated. She was genuinely remorseful about believing Harold's lies and treating me as if I were mentally unstable. But she was also angry that I had chosen to expose Harold's crimes at her wedding, destroying what should have been the happiest day of her life. "I understand why you did it," she said during our first conversation in over 10 years. "But I can't help feeling like you could have found a different way, a different time, that wouldn't have ruined my wedding day." I understood her feelings, but I also knew that Harold's crimes had to be stopped, and that public exposure was the only way to ensure that his victims received justice. There was no good time to arrest someone for embezzlement, and waiting longer would have allowed him to steal even more money from innocent people. The process of rebuilding relationships with my mother and sister was slow and painful. Too much damage had been done, too many years had been lost, and too much trust had been broken for us to simply return to being a normal family. But we were able to establish a foundation of mutual respect and understanding that hadn't existed before. Grandma Rose, who had been the one person to consistently believe in my integrity throughout the entire ordeal, was vindicated by the revelation of Harold's crimes. She had known that something was wrong with Harold's explanations and my family's treatment of me, even when she couldn't articulate exactly what was bothering her. The community's response to Harold's crimes was mixed. Some people were angry about being victimized and embarrassed about being deceived by someone they had trusted completely. Others were surprisingly supportive of our family, understanding that Harold's crimes were his responsibility alone, and that we had also been victimized by his lies and manipulation. Mrs. Patterson, whose Social Security account had been systematically drained by Harold, was one of the most gracious victims. When she learned that I had tried to expose Harold's crimes 10 years earlier, she thanked me for my courage and apologized for not believing me when my family rejected my accusations. "You did the right thing, dear," she told me at Harold's sentencing hearing. "It took courage to stand up to your own father, and it took even more courage to come back and make sure his victims got justice. Thank you for not giving up on us." The personal healing process was longer and more complex than the legal resolution. I had to work through 10 years of accumulated anger, guilt, and grief, with the help of therapy and the support of friends who had become my chosen family. I had to learn how to forgive my mother and sister for choosing Harold's lies over my truth, while also setting boundaries to protect myself from future manipulation or gaslighting. Most importantly, I had to forgive myself for waiting so long to expose Harold's crimes. I understood intellectually that I had been a 17-year-old girl facing an impossible situation. But emotionally, I still carried guilt about all the people who had been victimized during the years I remained silent. My career with the FBI continued to flourish, partly because my experience with Harold's case had given me unique insights into the psychology of white-collar criminals and their victims. I became a specialist in cases involving family dynamics and financial abuse, helping other agents understand how trusted family members can manipulate and victimize their relatives. The most profound lesson I learned from this experience was about the difference between family loyalty and enabling criminal behavior. True loyalty sometimes requires confronting people you love when they're doing wrong, even if that confrontation destroys relationships and causes personal pain. Looking back now, I realize that Harold's exile of me when I was 17 was actually a gift, though I couldn't see it at the time. It freed me from a toxic family dynamic and forced me to build my own life based on my own values rather than someone else's lies. It taught me to trust my own judgment and to have the courage to speak truth even when doing so comes at great personal cost. The file I carried into St. Mary's Cathedral that day contained more than just evidence of financial crimes. It contained proof that integrity matters more than family acceptance, that justice for innocent victims outweighs personal comfort, and that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who are most willing to sacrifice you to protect their own interests. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between family loyalty and doing what was right? How did you handle it? Let me know in the comments below because I'd love to hear your thoughts on this impossible choice. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more true stories about family dynamics, justice, and finding the courage to stand up for what's right. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that choosing integrity over family acceptance is sometimes the bravest and most loving thing you can do. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the family that chooses you is stronger than the family you're born into. Sometimes protecting the innocent matters more than protecting those who refuse to see the truth. And sometimes love requires having the courage to say no to the people who are supposed to love you most.